Good morning. I want to thank everyone so much for coming to this second session of the Capitoline seminars. We are all very honored to have here with us Professor Daniel Kapust from University of Wisconsin-Madison. But before I introduce him and let him speak, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Capitoline seminars and the dynamic of these lectures. These seminars are being organized by the Center for Studies of Political Thought from Federal University of Santa Catarina, because we felt that it would be interesting to invite some scholars that we have a connection with here in the group, and that would likely be available for giving lectures at this moment to exchange some ideas and get in touch with a new audience. So the idea is bringing these different people together to talk about a common theme, which is Republic. The name Capitoline Seminars is a reference to a moment in the history of the ancient Roman Republic in which the Roman people also had to stay at home, stay inside the Capitolium for months on end to protect themselves against a common threat. And just like it was for them, the future is a little uncertain for us, and it seems like a good idea to discuss the public thing, the Republica, the Republic. And today we have here with us Daniel Kapust. He's a political theorist interested in the history of political thought, Roman, in the Renaissance and modern times. His research encompasses themes such as rhetoric, republicanism, empire, and democratic theory. He has published in American Political Science Review, Journal of Politics, Political Theory, European Journal of Political Theory, Contemporary Political Theory, History of Political Thought, Journal of the History of Ideas, and Political Studies. He authored Republicanism, Rhetoric, and Roman Political Thought in 2011, and Flattery in the History of Political Thought in 2018, that I hope that will be available in Portuguese in the near future, both published by Cambridge University Press. Professor Kapust is going to talk to us about Machiavelli and empire, and then he's going to take questions. Feel free to write your question in the chat box and even to ask questions in Portuguese, because Peterson can translate them to us. I ask everybody to turn off their microphones and cameras during the lecture to keep the things going on smooth. And so thank you so much for being here with us, Daniel, and the floor is yours.
All right, well, thank you all for taking part today. It's really very nice to see you all. Tiago and I, a couple of weeks back, we had a little FaceTime chat too. But I wanted to start by saying that my wife and I, we still have conversations about our wonderful memories of being welcomed by the community in Florianopolis, and the intellectual stimulation of presenting our work, and obviously the beautiful scenery. So it really is a treat to see you all, and it's, hopefully someday soon we can do it in person. So the paper that I sent along and that I want to talk about today, it's part of a new book project I'm working on. The book project is tentatively titled The Tragedy of the Imperial Republic. The paper I sent and I'm going to talk about, I've called Machiavelli and the Three Tragedies of Empire. And that'll become most clear, I think, towards the end of why I say three tragedies. So anyway, what I'll talk about in the paper I sent, it's the core of a chapter from the book. And what this full chapter is going to do is put Machiavelli much more fully into conversation with a variety of his predecessors and contemporaries, including but not limited to Leonardo Bruni, but also Francesco Guicciardini and a variety of other folks. Depending on the book, how it turns out, this will be the third chapter or the fourth chapter. I may try to write a chapter on Venice prior to this, but this will follow certainly a chapter on the Roman Republic. There's going to be a chapter on the English Commonwealth, the Dutch Republic, and late 18th century America. So I'll turn now to the paper, and I'm just going to sort of read and talk about some portions of it. So what I do in the paper and what I'm going to do in the chapter is I take up a strand of argument about Machiavelli that's been advanced recently, especially by Michelle Clark, who's at Dartmouth, and Catherine Zuckert, who retired just not long ago from Notre Dame. And what this strain of scholarship does is it challenges a variety of readings of Machiavelli that see him as a sort of straightforward, unambiguous imperialist. I take things a little further than Clark and Zuckert. I argue just as they do, they argue this, that he is ambivalent about imperialism. But I argue that this is an ambivalence evident in two sorts of problems posed to Rome's status as a republic, problems that come from Rome being a conquering power. First, Machiavelli shows, and I think this is less controversial, but I think he shows that Roman imperialism is in the end destructive of Roman republican liberty. Now, that's an argument that he makes from the perspective of the metropole, from the perspective of Rome. If you're Roman, if you value liberty, you should be skeptical of empire because of what it will do to your liberty. And it's important to keep in mind, as you all know, that Rome was an empire long before it had an emperor, right? These are terms that don't mean the same thing necessarily to them that they do to us. Rome had a massive empire long before the Battle of Actium. But what I want to talk more about today is that Machiavelli shows not just that Roman imperialism is bad for Roman liberty, but it's bad for liberty writ large, not only with respect to Rome's immediate neighbors, right? Rome's first conquests are, in Machiavelli's view, republics, right? But it's so devastating that its effects last into the 16th century, right? Rome's empire destroys liberty for 1,000 years. So empire may have been necessary to secure Roman liberty in a certain way. Maybe it's the most visible manifestation of Roman virtue, what Machiavelli in Discourse 2.2 calls Rome's excessive virtue. But the thing that makes Roman virtue and liberty, or the thing that Roman virtue and liberty bring about, they destroy not only Roman virtue and liberty, but virtue and liberty throughout virtually all of Europe. That's part of why I think this is a tragic narrative, right? Now, making this argument, I'm going to suggest that the tragic dimension in his argument about Roman imperialism, it goes to a tension in Republican liberty itself. So I'll just introduce this point, but Quentin Skinner, went in his Liberty Before Liberalism, I think 1998, he says, look, a republic is free in two different ways. First and foremost, it's free insofar as it is not subject to the arbitrary interference of any group within its territory, right? So free institutions, absence of domination at home. It's also free insofar as it's not subject to the arbitrary group of any, or arbitrary interference of a group or individual from outside its territory. Now, the prior is what Republican scholars tend to focus on: free institutions, constitutionalism, checks and balances, etc. The latter is really international relations, and Skinner will sometimes talk about it. Pettit sometimes talks about it, but it's really a background concern, I think, for them. Now, what I think is the case is that liberty as a free state internally and liberty as a free state externally, they can be at odds with each other, and I think they are in Machiavelli. But the tension between them lends itself to being resolved by a very particular story about empire. This is the story we encounter with Leonardo Bruni. We encounter this in Rome. For Bruni, imperial conquest of a republican sort is basically a win-win. The conqueror makes the conquered free. The conqueror's virtue makes the conquered virtuous. Now, what I'm going to argue is that that is not how Machiavelli sees conquest. Conquest is a zero-sum affair for Machiavelli. And we will also see with Machiavelli that insofar as a state builds institutions strong enough to ensure liberty internally, it will probably build institutions strong enough to deprive other people of their liberty. Okay, now, in the next section of the paper, which I'm not going to talk about, I'll just say I discussed very briefly Machiavelli's account of the relationship between Roman institutions and political culture and Roman conquest. This is, pretty widely discussed in scholarship on Machiavelli. And I highlight the ways in which Rome's expansion undermines Rome's free institutions and its liberty-supporting political culture, extended commands, inequality, those kinds of things. What I really want to do, though, is focus on the next section of paper, which is where I get into tragedy. So I'm going to just skip to that and turn to that. Now, just to summarize, though, the argument that I make about Rome's domestic institutions and its conquest was that it is tragic, right? Rome's free institutions, Rome's civic virtue enable it to conquer others, but the conquest, and then in particular the institutional innovations they bring about, they undermine Roman liberty, right? And that, I think, is tragic. This is tragic in the sense of Aeschylus or Sophocles or Shakespeare or Euripides. Ethical conduct, things that they think are right to do for them, they backfire and they undermine the ethical conduct itself. I'm more interested today to talk about what Machiavelli says with respect to Rome's conquest of other peoples. Machiavelli is, I think, very sympathetic to the peoples that Rome conquered, or at least to the Italian peoples that Rome conquered. So we can look at Discourse 2.1. Machiavelli challenges there what he takes to be Plutarch's position. Plutarch thinks that Rome got lucky in acquiring an empire. And Machiavelli would say, no, the Romans were virtuous. In fact, he says, the greatest evidence of Roman virtue, what he calls excessive virtue, or in Italian, una eccessiva virtù, it's the fact, he says, that Rome's first conquests are free republics, right? And he says in 2.1, nor is it ever reported that there was any king there here's Italy, Rome's immediate vicinity. There's never reported any king there outside those who reigned in Rome and Porsenna, king of Tuscany. Now, a few lines earlier, Machiavelli says, in those times, all were free peoples in Italy. So these cities that Rome conquers, the Samnites, the Etruscans, etc., they are free in the sense of not being ruled by foreign powers, but they're also free in the sense, of being republics. So not only were they free, Machiavelli says, and the republics, they're fierce. They have, he says, a love for freedom. They defended it, he says, so obstinately that Rome could only have defeated them through their excessive virtue. Now, Machiavelli does not hesitate to describe their resistance to Rome as resistance to servitude. He uses the language of slavery. And this resistance is rooted in the fact that these free peoples know, as he puts it, the harms that peoples and cities suffer when they become slaves. Now, Machiavelli links the affection for the free way of life to expansionism, but it's not just territorial expansion. It's expansion, he says, in riches and dominion. And you can't have that without liberty, right? There can't be growth without liberty. And the mechanism behind this expansion, he says, is that free cities pursue the common good. Now, setting aside the point that Machiavelli makes about Christianity's role in weakening the love of liberty, Machiavelli's clear in the discourses that the real cause of the decline of the love of freedom for him is the Roman Empire. And he's very direct about why this is the case. The Roman Empire, with its arms and its greatness, eliminated, he says, all republics and all civil ways of life. This is also Discourse 2.1. They did this, he says, in spite of the fact that they found a conspiracy of republics very armed and very obstinate in their defense of their freedom. So this is why I say it's zero sum when it comes to liberty, right? Machiavelli actually says this explicitly in 2.17. Every reason, he says, agrees that as the Latins became servile, that's the English translation, the Italian is servi, meaning literally slaves, so the Romans would have become servile, servi, if they had not won. He alludes to Livy here. He's talking about Roman warfare with the Latins. They were alike, he says, in every respect, in order, virtue, obstinacy, and number. The Romans win, he says, in this instance, not because the Latins were weak, but because the Romans were just more ruthless, right? He says that, Manlius Torquatus kills his own son, and Decius Mucius kills himself. And the Latins just can't achieve that level of just brutality. So the story he's telling about Rome and Rome's conquest isn't the story that the Romans often like to tell about themselves. The Romans like to think that they are just an innocent agricultural people beset by these vicious neighbors who just want to attack them and keep them from farming. Not so, Machiavelli says. Rome's neighbors are not villains. They are not radically other. The Romans and the Latins are deeply similar for him. Now, I think this is tragic, right? And I'm quoting here from an article by an IR scholar last name Frost. In tragedy, he says, the conflict in the agon, the action of the play or the contest of the play, is not between a protagonist taken to be good and an antagonist understood to be the ethically unacceptable other. That would be, superhero villainy, but that wouldn't be a tragedy. These are not fights, he says, between good and evil, between the foreigner and us, or between friends and enemies. These are fights between people who are similar. Think Aeschylus, think Euripides, think Shakespeare. Now, that's not a flattering vision of the Roman Republic and its conquests. We don't find in Machiavelli what we find, for example, in Virgil. This is what Virgil has very famously Anchises say to Aeneas in the underworld. Roman, remember by your strength to rule earth's peoples. Your arts are to be these, to pacify, to impose the rule of law, to spare the conquered, to battle down the proud. That's the Fitzgerald translation of the Aeneid. Now, Virgil may not be entirely sincere. I suspect he's not. But even if he's insincere, this is a very typical, I think, ideological explanation that legitimizes Rome's imperialism. More to the point, though, contextually speaking, we don't see what Machiavelli says in his Italian predecessors, his Florentine predecessors, I should say. In fact, he says something very different from them. Take Leonardo Bruni. This is what he says in the Laudatio, his oration in the praise of Florence after it's emerged victorious with the war from the war with Milan. Now, Bruni's argument relies in part on there being a kinship between the Florentines and the Romans. Bruni says explicitly, the fact that the Florentine race arose from the Roman people is of utmost importance. And then he says it's a Roman tradition to defend the liberty of Italy against its enemies, just as, in his view, Florence had defended the liberty of Italy in its recent war with Milan. Now, what Bruni has to say about Florence's military exploits, though, is even more ideological than what he says about Rome. Florence, he says, has suffered many dangers for the freedom and security of other states and safeguarded the welfare of many others out of its own resources. Now, if you look at the Latin original of the Laudatio, Bruni calls Florence patrocinium. This is a Latin term. This is actually a term that Cicero uses in his work, De Officiis, on duties. And Cicero uses it to describe the Roman Empire. He says it's not dominion, it is, in fact, a patrocinium. And this notion of a patrocinium, it comes out of Roman law and I guess really sort of social law. And it refers, this is quoting a commentary on Cicero, to the responsibility of the patronus, the patron, to protect the legal rights of the client, the clients in Latin. Now, Cicero likes this better than the term imperium to describe Roman foreign relations, because if it's an imperium, then it's just unlimited power based upon superior force. And that just doesn't feel so good. So he describes it as a patrocinium. Now, one thing I found as I was looking into this, which I found quite interesting, is that the likely source for Bruni is probably Cicero. I mean, he's obviously read Cicero's On Duties, but when you read Dante's text, De Monarchia, Dante uses the term patrocinium to describe imperial relations too. So it's already trickling around in Tuscany, well before Bruni is writing. Now I'm going to skip a little ahead here towards the conclusion and just say a few things about where I wrap up. I think it's been about 20 minutes. I don't want to go too long. But the question I asked towards the end of the paper is, does this reading that I advance of Machiavelli, that he is highlighting the harms of empire, both to the Roman Republic and to free peoples around Rome, does that mean he is an anti-imperialist thinker? Now, you can point out the unintended and unanticipated harms of empire and how it can harm the metropole. That could lead you to oppose empire for pragmatic reasons, but that's not really a principled stance against empire rooted in the love of liberty of all human beings. Pointing out the harms that empire brings to liberty per se, that is, I think, a more powerful and more principled argument against empire. And I think we see both of those in Machiavelli. But I think it's still tragic. Why? Machiavelli is pretty clear that he is very skeptical about a republic simply saying, we will not be an empire, right? Outside of very unusual circumstances. In Discourse 2.19, Machiavelli outlines the Roman way of engaging in imperialism, and he calls this policy, this set of policies, the true way to make a republic great and to acquire empire. So he's going to make Rome great again. He then goes on to say that if this mode of expanding does not please them here is referring to other republics and princes, you should think that acquisitions made any other way, he says, are the ruin of republics. So it's either the Roman way or not, and you go the Roman route, you're committing yourself to all sorts of policies and procedures. The problem, he says, is it's impossible for a republic to say, well, we're not going to do that. And as he puts it, stay quiet and enjoy its freedom in little borders, right? This republic faces a catch-22. If it will not molest others, says Machiavelli, it will be molested, and from being molested will arise the wish and the necessity to acquire. If it does not have an enemy outside, it will find one at home, as it appears necessarily happens to all great cities. Now he says, look, I know Germany seems to be different, and we know that in the discourses, Machiavelli likes to talk about this German alternative where liberty still reigns and they're all free and virtuous. But he basically says, well, the problem is you can't imitate Germany. Number one, you got the emperor there. He basically puts a check on any of them becoming too powerful. They all band together against the emperor. So that can't work. And then he says that because of this, they can live content with their small dominion. But they have to have this enemy nearby, he says, who would seize them if there was any discord. Take away these unique characteristics, and he does think they're unique. And these cities, he said, would be just as imperialistic as Rome would have been. Because these circumstances are so unique, he says, you cannot imitate them, okay? You either need to do the Roman way of expansion, or, he says, you imitate leagues. And we know that for him, the model league that he really is interested in is the League of the Etruscan Cities, the Tuscan League, and he's writing to Tuscans, modern-day Etruscans. Now, he's pessimistic about regimes seeking to avoid empire in many places, other than just the one I just alluded to. 1.6, for example, is a place, and that's where he says, well, you can go the Spartan and Venetian route, or you can go the Roman route. Sparta and Venice, they had a good run. Venice was free for a long time, but when empire came, they snapped. They couldn't do it. So he says, you can't really balance things. So everything's in motion, he says. They cannot remain steady. Many things that reason does not bring you, necessity does. So he says you should go the more honorable route and avoid the middle way, and you create a republic that can expand if it needs to. Now, I don't think that that makes it a non-tragic account. That just makes it even more realistic, even more ambivalent. Um, Now, it sounds fatalistic, and I think there is some fatalism in Machiavelli. I think he doesn't see much of a viable way out. Um, and maybe what's going on is, and people will argue this, look, everything's in flux in life. So you just make it go as long as it can. There's nothing is permanent for Machiavelli. Now, I'm actually fairly persuaded by Catherine Zuckert, who argues in her book on Machiavelli that he's really interested in the Tuscan League. And what he really wants in Tuscany is a league. I mean, Florence will be dominant within it, but it'll be much more like the Etruscans than Rome being the hidden master of its allies. But I do think that Machiavelli's view is fundamentally tragic. Now, it might sound like an odd thing to say, in part because the work I've been discussing, the discourses, it's not a tragedy. It's hard to characterize. It's not a history either. It's not even like a commentary. I'm not sure what it is, but it's not a tragedy, at least by genre, by Aristotelian convention. But we also know that Machiavelli refers to himself in a letter to Francesco Guicciardini. This is letter 300. He signs it Niccolo Machiavelli, historian, comic author, and tragic author, storico, comico, e tragico. Now, Martinez, among others, has shown how much tragic elements actually feature in Machiavelli's writings, and not just his literary works. Think, Cliziar, Mandragola, Belphegor. They're all over the place. Martinez describes the Florentine histories as drawing on the common theme in Renaissance historical thought, that history is dominated by fortune, which gives it a tragic structure. Rise, fall, the limitations on human agency and forethought. This is tragedy, and they're all over Machiavelli's writings. So I have in mind then, this is going to the 3 points about tragedy, the 3 ways of thinking about tragedy. I have in mind in part the classic Aristotelian notion of the tragic error, or hamartia in the Greek. The Romans are not simply virtuous, but they're excessively virtuous, and their excessive martial prowess, which is a manifestation, ironically enough, of their liberty, of their civic virtue, of their religiosity, it undermines itself, just as Oedipus's curiosity is his own undoing. But I also have in mind a notion of tragedy we find in international relations, and there's increasingly a literature in international relations looking to tragedy to think about IR. This is Brown writing. Whatever we do in a given situation will be, from one perspective, acting wrongly. Now, it may well have been for Machiavelli that it was either the liberty of the Romans or the Latins, but either way, liberty was going to perish, okay? Now, that's a vision of Roman imperialism pursuing its greatness and its liberty and destroying the liberty of others. Had it not done that, it still would have lost its liberty. That's a very non-ideological way of explaining things. It's much less naive, I think, than what we find in Bruni. So that's the second sense of tragedy, that there is no unambiguous right answer. Now, the third sense of tragedy, and this has come through a little bit in my comments earlier, is I think Machiavelli's attuned to just the human devastation, right? The more normal use of the word tragedy. The human devastation wrought by Rome upon its neighbors. Now, it's worth noting by way of conclusion, and this is going to be part of the book's overall argument, that I think it's the case that when you read Philip Pettit or Quentin Skinner or Frank Lovett or other people writing about republicanism, you don't see much about empire and imperialism. Now, I find that an odd omission, in part because the republics that are at the heart of the republican tradition, Rome, Florence, the Dutch Republic, the English Commonwealth, 18th century America, and of course Venice, they are all empire builders. Now, some are more successful than others. Florence can barely hold Pisa, but look at Rome, look at the Dutch Republic. They're very powerful, successful empires. So too Venice. empire built on land taken from the Byzantines. But I also think that Rome's status as an empire and the way that Florence emulates Rome as an imperial republic, it's not an accident. I think it comes from, or has to do with, the story they tell about themselves, right? The story they tell to make sense of themselves as a people. They are virtuous citizens, free at home, bringing liberty to those they conquered. Now that is, I think, the story that a polity tells about itself to make sense of its devotion to liberty while depriving others of their liberty. Okay, and that is where I will pause, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments. I'm hoping you folks are still there. Oh, okay.
Sorry, I was with my microphone turned off. So I like thank you for the lecture. It's always good to hear you, and hopefully the next one will be alive in some point of the next months or years. So right now I think that we can take the questions from the audience. Anyone wants to start?
I can hear your dog, Tiago.
No, it's not mine. It's the neighbor's dog. I mean, he's just insane, man. And you know, with all those delivery services, they just keep barking all day long. So, anyone, Ricardo? Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
First, thank you very much, Daniel, for your wonderful talk, and also for share with us your paper. Well, I am in agreement with you when you say that most of contemporary Republican theorists doesn't care too much about the empire, which is very odd. But you mentioned a few times in your paper the contribution of John McCormick, and you agree with him in a few points, and important points, when he deals with the subject of empire in Machiavelli. And one of them, one of these agreements is that you consider, just like Machiavelli as a sort of anti-elitist thinker. The first question is that if you think that this is the same that say assume that Machiavelli is also a populist thinker. And in the end of your paper, actually the last two words of your paper, in a footnote, you mentioned that McCormick has a sort of account about the problem of empire in Machiavelli, in which he presents this this proposal of Machiavelli as a sort of rhetorical trick to persuade the Florentine Republican elite to accept higher levels of people's participation in Republican institutions. I'd like you try to compare your account, which is very persuasive because it solves a lot of problems. At least it seems to me, in considering Machiavelli's proposal of empire, and McCormick's account of the same problem. If you can make those two accounts compatible, or they are different ones.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point. I mean, yeah, John's basic argument is that you got to take the dedicatees really seriously. These are two members of the Florentine elite. They are young. Machiavelli says in several places they're right for the young, and they're not princes, but they could be princes. And part of the pitch for republicanism or for democracy, John would say, that he makes to Rucellai and Bondomonte is, well, you guys are going to have a blast. I mean, you're just going to go out and conquer stuff, and people are going to love you. You're going to get all this glory, and it's it's a good time. You should, because your alternative is Sparta, right? Well, the more interesting one in 16th century Florence is Venice, because Venice calls itself La Serenissima. It's the most peaceful, right? And Venice is a republic, but is an unabashed oligarchy, and they all call themselves aristocrats, right? It's a totally different model. And we know that, John and others talk about this, that Venice is invoked as the sort of antithesis, especially to the populist strain of Florentine republicanism that finds its expression most fully in the short-lived regime after the Ciampi, but also, after they get rid of the Medici. So I think John is right that may be the sort of part of the rhetorical structure of what Machiavelli's doing, especially if we take seriously the audience. The irony, though, is that so the outcome of that is they're going to have an armed, active populace that has a lot of leverage. It has a lot of voice. Now, in the end, maybe the elites are still going to kind of backdoor dominate by means of religious manipulation. But the people, John will say, they're good judges, all these kinds of things. The irony, though, within that account is that I think Machiavelli's clear that it's going to undermine itself. So let's say they do go the Roman route and they somehow pull this off, even though he says the best we can hope to do in Tuscany is to emulate the Etruscans, and any city that has unfree beginnings cannot be Rome. And he's clear that Florence has unfree beginnings because it started by Rome under a period of conquest. All that aside, let's say they pull this off. Well, what the end result is going to be that it's going to exhaust itself through imperial expansion and destroy liberty anyway, right? And so to me, it's just not what John is doing. I don't think he would disagree. In fact, I know he wouldn't, because we talked about this. But I think there's a populist case to make against empire. And it's precisely that a regime which commits itself to empire, even for ostensibly good reasons, ultimately undermines popular liberty, right? Now, maybe the people benefit in certain ways, especially at the beginning, but at a certain point, you've got executives that are unaccountable executives, right? And arbitrary power springs up. I think John agrees with that. I also know he would just say, well, that's just not what I was doing. So I don't think, if that makes sense, I don't think John's reading is blind to empire. And in fact, John generally, I think, would say empire is a product of the elites. You would compare that, let's say, to somebody like, Vicky Sullivan, let's say, or a lot of Straussian readings. And the empire, everybody wants it, right? And of course, the Straussian readings, republicanism is an accident. The real goal for Machiavelli is empire. If a republic gets you there, great. If it doesn't, that's fine too. John thinks the real goal for Machiavelli is democracy and liberty, and empire is used to get that. But I think John would agree that empire will eventually undermine liberty too. I just see it as operating in different senses. I hope that's answering the question.
Yes. Thank you very much. I have another small question, if you allow me, Thiago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
So you mentioned that liberty for Machiavelli, in this discussion of empire, is a zero-sum. Zero-sum equation, let's say in this way. But you say that thinking about the liberty in Rome vis-a-vis the liberty outside, okay? In other republics around Rome, which Rome destroyed. Okay, but that is in short term. When you think about the same equation in a long term, it seems to me that liberty is a sort of, is an equation which is a kind of negative sum, not just a zero sum, because the liberty in Rome also was compromised.
Oh,
What
yeah,
do you think about that?
Oh, no, I would agree. I mean, I think it's zero sum vis-a-vis its like, so, you know, if you think equation, one side is Roman, one side is that, or scale, right? But in the long run, it's completely negative sum, because even Rome winds up becoming enslaved, and they become enslaved to themselves, or to a portion of themselves, which is precisely what a republican regime is supposed to prevent the occurrence of, right? So you're right. On the whole, empire, it's zero sum with respect to comparing different regimes or different city-states in the case of antiquity. But overall, it's a net loss. You're not going to come out ahead on liberty with respect to empire, because not only are you going to eliminate the liberty of others, and again, one could argue, and you know, we saw that in Virgil, you see this in Cicero, that Rome is not depriving others of liberty, it is spreading law, it's helping them, right? Come on. And maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but I suspect that if you ask the people they were fighting, they would say, no, you don't. Think of Tacitus. Think of what, you know, we see in the Agricola. They make a desert and they call it peace, right? All that aside, even if it does square somehow, in the end, you wind up with Octavian, right? In Rome. And so Rome is not free once you've got Octavian. Now, again, the irony is they don't stop calling themselves a republic, right? There's a scholar, I have to read his book, he's at Ohio State, and he's a Byzantinist, and he argues that actually the Byzantines, of all people, thought they were the Roman Republic, which is kind of crazy, but he's quite persuasive about this. The words don't have the same meanings necessarily. But I think you're right. Yeah, long term, it is, you're not going to come out ahead.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Marlio, you're next. Please go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing your thought with us. It was very, very interesting, your paper and your conference. My first question is about your interpretation of Machiavelli as a tragic author. The modern political philosophy in general theorizes the state, the political community, the constitutional order, without imagining its end. The political community as a perpetual corpus, if you want. Baudin saw this issue, and from him and Hobbes, this seems to be a constant trend in our constitutional thought, in our political thought. This is naturally not a problem for the ancient thinkers, Aristotle, Polybius, Cicero, and not for Machiavelli. Political communities for all these pre-modern thinkers arise and die naturally, fatalistically, as you said. My question is, was the tragic character of Machiavelli a characteristic of Machiavelli himself, or maybe a tendency of the pre-modern political thought in general terms? What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think there's certainly something. I mean, when is it the case that if people stop thinking tragically about human affairs, both individual humans and collectivities, when is it the case that they do that? I mean, if there's a moment, it's going to probably be scientific revolution, right? That we can stop the wheel. And, you know, we know that Fortuna, the goddess, is often represented on or at the center of a wheel in late medieval and Renaissance artwork, right? And there's a cyclical dimension. And, you know, it's, in a way, it's comforting to think things might be cyclical, that as bad as it is, it'll get better, right? Wheel keeps turning. You can also just have full-on eschatology where it's going to get really bad and then it's all done, right? And then we have the resurrection, which is, you know, better than the alternative. But if it is the case that people stop thinking in that sense, and Machiavelli alludes to Rome being perpetual at one point. I think he's skeptical of a republic being perpetual. It's probably going to happen sometime, you know, with British empiricism. Now, Hobbes, what's interesting is that he, you know, you think of the frontispiece of Leviathan, you've got the figurative representation of the Leviathan, the human head comprised of bodies of individuals who are all actually looking at him, right? Holding the fire in one hand, the sword in the other. In Latin, it says, you know, above nothing, there is no power on earth that compares to him. And he stands on two sets of symbols, state and church, right? And the best part is that the curtain under the Leviathan, it's a theater curtain, right? It's actually what would have been used in a theatrical production. And so this is really rich symbolism. And it seems to be the case that Hobbes thinks that this could last forever. Now, I think Hobbes is deeply pessimistic and skeptical about that happening. The only way it can happen is if you fundamentally reform the university system, right? Because that's where the seditious doctrine spread from. But even if he's pessimistic, I don't think he's tragic, right? Because what's going to cause the problem isn't the application of the cure to the disease. That's tragic, right? That by pursuing what's probably the only course that is right, I'm ultimately going to cause the harm. For him, that's not what's going on. I think he just thinks people are just stubborn and recalcitrant, right? And you know, maybe that's tragic, but then the tragedy is human nature or something like that. But it's not that, you know, right. I mean, Noel Malcolm's argued pretty persuasively that whatever form we now have Leviathan in, it started out as something he was writing for the Prince of Wales, Charles II, while he's exiled in France. And Hobbes really does seem to think, in his own bizarre way, that if I could just somehow get a king to read this and put this all in place, problem solved, which is ludicrous. It's never going to happen. But, you know, Hobbes tried to square the circle, so he does these things. But I think he's much more optimistic in a way than Machiavelli is. I think, so I do think this is a broader pre-modern tendency. And, you know, Greece is the birthplace of tragedy. And we have tragic sensibilities in Rome, right? I mean, Aristotle says that a tragedy, it's a drama featuring people who are better than us in a way, but not that much better. They can't be worse than us. If they're worse than us, then, you know, it's just comedy, right? If they're that much better than us, it's not going to inspire pity and fear. It inspires revulsion. So we have to see ourselves in them. And we see, you know, this is Martha Nussbaum. That's the fragility of goodness. We see the fragility of things in them. So I think that's Machiavelli. Now, are there pre-modern thinkers who are, you know, kind of utopian? I think so. Does that become more common, perhaps, maybe after the 17th century? I think that's also probably true.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
There's anybody else who wants to make a question?
May I?
Yeah, Marcus,
Of course,
go ahead.
yeah.
Man.
Okay. Thank you. Well, first I would like to say thank you for Thiago and the organizers, the students that are organizing these seminars.
those the guilties are the case. I'm just a part of it.
Okay. Nice. Thank you. Anyway, okay, and thank you for Professor Kapust for be here now and share your brilliant draft article, because are very inspiring for me. And my question is about some themes that you have been treated here. Machiavelli, and it was mentioned in your article about the two dimensions of the persecution of a free republic. One of these is expressed by the relationship between inexistent non-domination or existence of non-domination in internal states that Skinner treated in your book, and the relationship of this with the external non-domination between states. The other dimension is that of mentioned by Ricardo about this, how can I say, this anti-elitist or populist characteristic of Machiavelli thought, or it is related with inequality. My question is about this. Generally, this dimension, the second dimension related to inequality, is referred by the internal to the internal dimension of the space of the states. I would like to say, I would like to ask you if we can find, or we can find space to talk with or about Machiavelli, about the international inequality as an obstacle to free republics. Okay.
Yeah, I think, yeah. Right. So in terms of time, yeah, when I talk about inequality, it's basically, I'm especially interested in when and how he talks about Rome, the fruits of empire, the material fruits of empire, undermining the equality that is required for what he calls the viva civile, right? Or the free way of life, or the civil way of life. But you're right. I mean, internationally, now initially Rome, it seems a contest of equals, right? You know, then they're first going out and conquering. At a certain point, that's no longer the case, right? By the time Rome has conquered Italy, and especially once it gets into Greece, we could say it's just too powerful. And once Rome, but even before that, let's say it has similarly powerful neighbors. If it's the case that Rome's internal orders are what Machiavelli says they are, Rome is still going to have some advantage against them. So what in that instance is going to restrain a powerful state from going out and dominating less powerful neighbors, right? One answer is morality. Machiavelli would laugh at that, I think, because he doesn't think that anybody does that. You know, it would be nice if they do, but even the Germans, he says, they're afraid of the emperor. So, you know, domestically, how do we do this? How do we prevent arbitrary interference? We have free institutions. We have institutions that check the powerful. I mean, I don't have a well thought out answer, but one route one could take is say, well, look, what this points to is the necessity of, you know, Kant's perpetual peace, that we're going to have peace treaties and organizations that enforce these treaties to restrain the will the arbitrary will of the powerful. That's not, at least overtly, that's not Machiavelli's solution. But I think, to your point, that might be part of the reason why he likes the League model, right? So the League, it can conquer, but it takes longer. It's more deliberate. They're slower, he says, but they can conquer if they need to. The advantage of a League is that it prevents any internal member from becoming too powerful, right? And it creates a sort of shared fate between these members. Now, again, for that to work, he's probably relying on there being the papal states in the south and France and Spain in the north, and they're going to be hemmed in. But a confederacy or a league, if this is, I'm hoping this is getting at your point, that's one way to think about that. Now, what could be the ultimate outcome? I mean, I love science fiction. A league of planets, right? That's the Federation in Star Trek, or a global league. That's the sort of aspiration, ideally, behind the League of Nations. A society of peoples who, even if they are not strictly speaking materially equal, right? One's more powerful, one's more wealthy. They are treated as such, and there are rules to enforce that treatment, just as, again, within a constitutional order. So, I mean, I think that's the way that one would need to go. Again, that makes him sound like a Kantian. But the alternative is either, states that simply can't expand, Germany, or the League. And I mean, what's interesting about the way you put it is that that's more evidence, I think, in support of the view that he likes the League, right? Now, because the Roman way is they are utterly dominant, but nobody knows it until it's too late, right? Well, that's not equality. Oh, sorry, you're muted. I can't hear if you're.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think that Mario has a second question, but I would like to address one question before him. And there's a certain point in your article that you state that in a certain sense, Rome was a victim of his own success. Mm-hmm. And we check Liv's history. There's a kind of an expansion in the peninsula during the 4th century before Christ. In the 3rd century, they go to the North Africa. And after the defeat of Hannibal, basically Rome is in charge of the Mediterranean Sea, or their borders. And the thing is that sometimes we can see that, at least you can think that there's not such a tendency to imperialism, to expansion in the early days of the Roman Republic. In certain sense, they are kind of, they have the allies, sometimes they get involved in some battle or some disputation in some cities near their territory or something like that. And, but in the end, they start expansion through the peninsula. But when we see the social wars from the 2nd to the 1st century before Christ, there's a kind of an anxiety from all those allies in the peninsula, though they are partners, they saucy. And the social war, there was a kind of the Samites eventually, probably they are trying to remove Rome from their neck or something. We want to be the powerful in this region. But the other Etruscan leagues and all the Latins that was fighting against Rome, in a certain sense, they are fighting for being absorbed by the Republic, to get their own rights and to get a kind of, to enjoy the wealthiest and the problems of the Roman Republic. So in that sense, my question is, after Machiavelli addressed for these two different kinds of imperialism, an imperialism that is made by circumstances and is not necessarily a dominated one, if we can put that in English, but it's a sort of a share with the neighbors, share with the other people in the peninsula, their law, they are wealthy and stuff like that. And another kind of imperialism that probably during the Principate and during the Empire, that was taking control, taking provinces and exploiting their provinces. So my question is like, in Machiavelli, there's a kind of a different, he thinks that is different, those so-called two kinds of imperialism, or and other way is, you can be a rich, a wealthy and powerful republic and not being imperialistic.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, to the extent that, I mean, other people may remember it better than me in this regard, to the extent that in the discourses, he'll have temporally sensitive accounts of Roman conquest. It'll often be, pre and post fall of Carthage. And what he seems to be more interested in is, I think, less how Rome treated its subject peoples with variation across space than what expansion meant for Rome at different moments. So early on, he seems to think, they're conquering the Samnites and the Capitolines and whoever. The people are really getting something out of it. It's nearby, they're getting land, and then at a certain point, it's just too far away, and the people don't want to move, and they don't want the land. That said, I mean, we do know that especially, I mean, Rome doesn't treat all peoples the same way, right? I mean, we know they're much nicer in certain respects about conquering the Greeks than they are about those in the Iberian Peninsula, right? Iberia's 200 years or whatever of just brutal warfare to reduce them to submission. And the Greeks, they plunder and they loot, but they don't, in general, massacre arguably entire cities. I mean, Corinth, they destroy Corinth. And then, the other thing with the Romans is, well, do you surrender or do they have to conquer you? If they have to conquer you, it's a different story. And even under the empire, the preferred Roman way of doing things was to delegate stuff to local elites, right? It was cheaper. It was cheaper to have local British oligarchs run stuff for you and keep the peace than it was to send in a Roman army. Think of, we know this in great detail about the ancient Near East. That's what the Herods are supposed to be doing, and they fail at that. So I think you're right about that being an aspect of Roman imperial development, and it ties in with the prior question that the further along it goes, perhaps the more overtly dominating Rome is, right? I think that my sense is we don't see that very much in Machiavelli's history. Now, the social war is interesting because why do they go to war? What is it? What's so important about Roman citizenship that Rome's allies, who, I mean, they're not equals to Rome, but, are they objectively as badly off as, let's say, somebody living in modern day Portugal or Spain? No, I mean, they're much better situated. Why do they go to war? And it's a bloody peninsula-wide war, right? And why won't Rome just give them the citizenship? I mean, it can't just be material, right? There's got to be some ideational dimension to that. It can't just be symbolic ideational either. I mean, there's probably a legal status associated too. Now, once at that point, everybody's Roman, right? I mean, Cicero says he's got two fatherlands, but he's a Roman, right? He's a Roman citizen by that point, where he would have been enfranchised, depending on the chronology. And even the Greeks living in southern Italy at that point, I think, become Roman, or not long after. I don't precisely remember. The Etruscans, who they don't even speak an Indo-European language, as far as we know, they're Roman, right? Now that's where the Virgilian kind of notion of spreading Rome, I think you see. Earlier on, I think the Romans are exactly as you put it, they're pretty content to, they'll reduce you to subordination, and then you've got to pay tribute or you got to send allies, but they'll basically let you run your city as you want to, as long as you don't cause any trouble, right? So I'm hoping that makes sense, but I think that, yeah, I don't think you see as much of that in Machiavelli. I think, at least in the passages I've looked at in detail, it's not as sensitive to the nuances of actual Roman imperial practice.
Thank you, Dan. Mario, you can make your second question if you want it.
Okay, thank you. This is a short one, and it's a question about the relation between Machiavelli and some of his Roman sources. Do you believe that Machiavelli's view of Roman imperialism could be explained by Machiavelli being a better reader or a better fan of living history rather than Cicero? I mean, could we conclude that for Machiavelli, Livy's account is closer than the effective reality of things, the realtà effettuale della cosa, than Cicero approach in his laws or in his De Officiis? Could we, don't know, we can take Machiavelli as a Livian follower, his work as a sort of a Livian revival in political writing?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly something. I mean, the funny thing, though, is he said, even in the preface, he says, he's gonna tell you the stuff you need to know to understand Livy. He's not just discussing Livy. He's helping you make sense of what Livy's actually saying. That said, he loves Livy. I mean, it's just like one of his childhood books, probably. His dad gets it, right? For doing the index. And I think what he likes about Livy more than Cicero, even though he's obviously knows Cicero really well, is the role of exempla in Livy and in Roman historiography more generally. Now, there's lots of exempla in Cicero because of the rhetorical background. What he likes about it is this historical occurrence is an instantiation of some principle. What I think he especially likes about Livy is that there are contrary exempla, right? Which requires him to then sort out what these mean. And it's also a form of writing and reasoning that is particularly, it lends itself to exhortation and, to persuasion. But I also think what he dislikes about Cicero on some level is a reflection of what we see in chapter 15 of the Prince. He's just making stuff up. Many have come before me and have imagined principality. And he won't have known as much of the De Republica as we do. He doesn't have the manuscript, but he knows a lot of it from Augustine or whoever, or from the Scipio's dream. And you think about Livy, it's the examples, it's that this is going to be life-giving or fruitful. There's the medical metaphor that frames the history. That's a different way of thinking about politics, I think, than the more, I don't think this is fair to Cicero, but what might be construed to be a more dispassionate, idealizing way of seeing things.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah.
Anybody else wants to make a question? Well, I think that we're all good. So then I would like again to thank you for your for your being here, for taking your time to have this awesome chat with us. I also thanks to the audience for being in this session of the seminar, and I hope to see you all in 2 weeks when we're gonna have a lecture from Caius Tuori from the University of Helsinki, and he was delivering a lecture on the Roman Republics, lives and afterlives. So thank you so much for you all, and hope to see you next time. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Take care.